The intake clerk at the Keshari Institute for Emergency Management Sciences was a young Vathan, a species that runs to long limbs and a particular kind of thin-wristed efficiency, and she processed me in approximately 90 seconds, which I found impressive. She scanned my exchange credentials, cross-referenced the compact observer registry, printed a laminated badge with my name rendered in the Institute's own alphabet beneath a transliteration she had clearly done by ear, and handed it over without once looking up from her terminal. The badge said Administrative Observer, Gallery Level 3. I clipped it to my jacket and found the lift. My name is Tomas Vrek. I was 56 years old at the time of the exercise. For 28 years, I worked as a structural fire safety compliance officer for the municipal authority of a mid-sized port city on Earth's northern coast. A city that had, by the time I retired, approximately 4,000 commercial and public buildings in active use, and I had been inside roughly 2/3 of them at some point. Usually with a clipboard and a tape measure, and a disposition toward the kind of professional skepticism that gets you called difficult by building owners and thanked by their insurers. I am not a soldier. I am not a scientist. I have no advanced academic credentials. What I have is 28 years of understanding exactly how buildings fail, and a particular habit, my wife called it a reflex, my former colleagues called it an affliction, of reading a building the moment I walk into one. Not looking at it, reading it. The way a person fluent in a language doesn't see words on a page but hears meaning. That is what happens when you spend nearly 3 decades checking compliance documentation against physical reality and discovering, over and over, that they disagree. The Compact Observer program had sent me to the Keshari Institute because someone in the Cultural Exchange Office had decided that Earth's fire safety and emergency preparedness frameworks were worth documenting for the broader compact record, and that a working practitioner rather than an academic would be the appropriate person to do the documenting. I agreed. I had retired 8 months earlier and found retirement poorly suited to my temperament. The offer was for a 6-week residency as an administrative observer, gallery access to live exercises, access to the Institute's building systems documentation for cross-reference, and 3 structured interview sessions with the Institute's senior faculty. None of which explained why, on the morning of day 3, I was standing at the entrance to the containment exercise annex on sublevel 4 rather than gallery level 3. I had taken the wrong lift. This was, in the subsequent inquiry, established as the primary human error in the chain of events that followed. There are 2 lift banks in the Institute's eastern wing, a public bank serving levels 1 through 5, and a restricted bank serving the sublevel facilities. They are adjacent. The signage distinguishing them is in Vathan glyphic script and in 3 other compact languages. It is not in any Earth language because, at the time of my visit, no Earth observer had ever needed to access the sublevels. The assumption was architecturally embedded. Observers stay in the gallery. The lifts are not labeled for anyone who might not know which one serves which purpose. I took the restricted lift. It accepted my badge, which had, due to a data entry error by the same intake clerk who had processed me with such impressive speed, been assigned gallery-level clearance plus inadvertent sublevel access. She had transposed 2 characters in my observer classification code, effectively upgrading me to the clearance tier used by exercise monitors. The lift did not tell me I was in the wrong place. The door opened on sublevel 4 and I stepped out into a corridor I did not recognize, which told me I was not on gallery level 3, and I stopped. The corridor was long, brightly lit, and smelled of processed air, not unusual for a sublevel facility. There were 12 cadets in it, in exercise gear, standing in 2 rows. They appeared to be receiving a pre-exercise briefing from a Keshari faculty member. A Sarathi, heavyset, in the Institute's gray and silver exercise monitoring uniform, holding a datapad and addressing the group in standard compact with a fluency that suggested long practice. The faculty member looked up when I stepped out of the lift. He noted my badge. He noted my age and bearing, which presumably did not match his roster. He opened his mouth to ask something, and then a second sound preempted him. A low, resonant alarm, 3 pulses, a pause, 3 pulses, that I later learned was the Keshari Class 4 exercise initiation signal. Exercise monitor Drevath Oslin, I would learn his name afterward, was faced with a choice in approximately 2 seconds. Hold the exercise initiation while he resolved the administrative anomaly of a 56-year-old Earth civilian standing at the back of his cadet cohort, or allow the initiation to proceed, because the 12-second window for initiation delay had already closed and aborting at this stage would require a written explanation to the Institute's Academic Oversight Board that would take considerably longer to resolve than whatever the observer had wandered into. He chose the latter. He made eye contact with me, held up one finger in what I understood as a hold gesture, and turned back to his cadets to deliver the final pre-exercise instruction. Remember, he said in standard compact, the protocol runs 72 hours. You are graded on sequential phase completion. Do not attempt to skip phases. The simulation does not accept out-of-order submissions. Work the phases. Phase 1 is atmospheric sampling. Begin. He pressed something on his datapad. The corridor sealed. I mean that precisely. 4 blast doors, each approximately 40 centimeters of composite material, dropped at intervals along the corridor's length with a succession of impacts that I felt through the soles of my feet. The lift door behind me sealed as well. Red lighting replaced the white. A steady low hum pressurization, I identified it immediately, began in the walls. The cadets moved. They had been trained for this. They broke into 3 teams of 4 and moved toward 3 separate equipment stations mounted in alcoves along the corridor walls, and they began pulling out atmospheric sampling rigs with the practiced efficiency of people who have drilled this specific action many times. I stood at the back of the corridor near the sealed lift and looked at the ceiling. 28 years of reading buildings. The ceiling was telling me something. I should explain what a Class 4 hazardous atmosphere breach simulation involves, because it is relevant to what happened next. The Keshari Institute's Class 4 exercise is a full facility seal and contain scenario. The simulation posits a catastrophic failure in a multi-level facility's atmospheric processing system, a breach that releases a non-lethal but incapacitating simulant compound through the building's ventilation network. The cadet's task is to locate the source of the breach, establish containment around it, purge the affected ventilation runs, and restore atmospheric integrity to the facility. The grading protocol runs 72 hours because this is the established baseline for how long it takes a trained 4-person team working sequentially through the 14 prescribed phases to complete the exercise. The protocol was written 41 years ago. The Keshari Institute was constructed 37 years ago. The building was designed to specification, passed its commissioning inspection, and has been in continuous use since. In those 37 years, the building has been modified 11 times, 3 heating plant upgrades, 2 ventilation system expansions to accommodate increased cadet enrollment, a structural reinforcement of the sublevel 4 floor to support the new exercise equipment, 1 replumbing of the northern corridor's drainage manifold, and most recently, 4 years ago, a retrofitted secondary pressurization loop added to the eastern wing to improve atmospheric control in the exercise spaces. I did not know any of this when I walked into that corridor. What I knew was what the building was telling me. There is a specific way a ceiling reads when the building above it has been modified after original construction. The junction lines change. The panel gaps are not quite parallel. There are shadow lines where original fastener positions were filled and repainted, and where new ones were added at intervals that don't quite match the original module spacing. If you have spent 28 years looking at ceilings in modified buildings, you recognize this the way you recognize a familiar face in a crowd, not by deliberate analysis, but by a kind of practiced peripheral recognition that has long since become automatic. The ceiling of the Keshari sublevel 4 Eastern Corridor had been modified. The pressurization system addition 4 years ago had required new ductwork, and the ductwork had been run above the ceiling panels in the most direct path from the mechanical room to the exercise spaces, which is always what contractors do because the most direct path is the least expensive. The most direct path passes through the structural web of an older building at whatever angles the original designers left available, which means it passes through compromises, places where the new duct had to be reduced in cross-section to fit between existing structural members, or where it had to transition from one type of material to another, or where it had been connected to the original ductwork at a joint that was accessible for installation, but would be difficult to inspect afterward. I knew this because it is what always happens, not in the Keshari Institute specifically, in every building I have ever inspected. Every structure has 3 places where the designer compromised and the builder made it work. The first is always in the original construction, a load-bearing calculation that was right on the edge of acceptable and was approved because the margin was technically sufficient. The second is in the first major modification, the retrofit that had to thread new systems through a building that wasn't designed for them, and the threading left a joint or a transition or a reduced section run somewhere that nobody wanted to document too carefully. The third is the small thing, the maintenance item that was logged as pending, rescheduled again, and eventually stopped appearing in the maintenance log because it had been pending for so long that it was no longer visible as an active item. Those 3 compromises are where buildings fail, always, not sometimes, always. I had 45 minutes before the first cadet team completed Phase 1 atmospheric sampling and moved to Phase 2 source localization. I used the 45 minutes to read the building. The corridor had a service panel, a standard maintenance access point in the east wall, roughly 80 centimeters by 60, secured with a flushable handle of the type used universally in institutional construction because it is easy to install, easy to operate, and completely unsuitable as a security measure because it opens from both sides. I opened it. Behind the panel was the access space above the ceiling, a crawl-accessible void approximately 90 centimeters deep, running the full length of the corridor. I was in the access space for roughly 35 minutes. What I found was consistent with everything the ceiling had told me. The retrofitted pressurization ductwork ran the length of the void in a path that reflected the obvious routing choices of a contractor working quickly, direct, efficient, and with 3 specific compromises. The first was a reduced section transition at the point where the new duct connected to the original building's atmospheric trunk line. The cross-section had been reduced by approximately 1/3 to thread between 2 original structural beams, and the joint had been sealed with a compound that was correct for the application, but had not been inspected since installation. The second was a material transition approximately 20 meters north, where the duct changed from the Institute's standard composite to a different composite from a different supplier. A subtle difference in thermal expansion coefficient that, over 4 years of pressure cycling, had opened a hairline gap at the joint ring. The third was a maintenance item, a pressure relief valve on the subfloor drainage manifold, originally installed to prevent backflow into the ventilation system during flooding events. That was in the wrong position, not locked open, not locked closed, but in an intermediate position that had no official designation and would have no effect on anything except in the precise scenario where the ventilation system was under abnormal pressure differential, at which point it would function as an uncontrolled bleed point between the atmospheric system and the drainage network. In a Class 4 breach simulation, The atmospheric system is under abnormal pressure differential by design. I came back out of the access space, replaced the panel, brushed composite dust off my jacket, and sat down on a bench near the sealed lift to think. The protocol had 14 phases. The cadets were on phase 1. The standard solution path for a Class 4 simulation runs through atmospheric sampling, source localization, vector mapping of the dispersal pattern through the ventilation runs, sequential isolation of affected sectors, physical access to the breach point, repair or bypass of the failed component, verification purge, and 7 additional confirmation and documentation phases that establish the facility is safe for reoccupation. 72 hours, 14 phases, sequential. The simulation does not accept out-of-order submissions. I had found the breach point in 35 minutes without any atmospheric sampling equipment. I had found it the way I find every breach point, by reading the building until it told me where the problem was. The problem was the joint ring at the material transition. The hairline gap had been there for 4 years. Under the pressure differential of a Class 4 simulation, it would open to perhaps 2 to 3 millimeters, enough to release a significant volume of simulant compound into the corridor void, and from there, into the general atmospheric circulation of the sublevel. The relief valve on the drainage manifold was the secondary issue. Once the void pressure rose, the mispositioned valve would bleed simulant into the drainage network, which connected to every sublevel space in the building. The fix was straightforward. The joint ring needed to be resealed. The relief valve needed to be repositioned. Both were accessible from the corridor void. The resealing compound was a standard atmospheric barrier sealant of the type carried in every exercise equipment kit I had seen the cadets unpacking. The valve repositioning required no tools, only the knowledge of which direction to turn it and the understanding of why the intermediate position was problematic. The cadets phase 2 through phase 14 would, if completed correctly, eventually arrive at the same conclusion, in 72 hours. I sat on the bench for a few more minutes. Exercise monitor Oslin had not spoken to me since the exercise began. He was moving between the 3 cadet teams, making notes on his datapad, and he had the focused expression of someone managing multiple simultaneous monitoring obligations who did not have spare attention for the administrative anomaly near the lift. I understood his position. He could not stop the exercise without paperwork. He could not remove me without stopping the exercise. The most rational course of action from his perspective was to continue monitoring his cadets and deal with the observer afterward. I was also aware, and I think he was aware, that the Compact Observer program had some standing at the Institute, and that removing a compact observer from an active exercise without cause would generate its own set of paperwork. So we had reached a position of mutual administrative tolerance. He was not going to ask me to leave. I was not going to get in the way. I was also aware that I had, in 35 minutes, found the solution to his cadets' 72-hour exercise. This created a situation that I was not entirely sure how to handle. I considered the options. The first option was to say nothing and sit on the bench for 72 hours while the cadets worked through their 14 phases. This was the most conservative choice and also the most uncomfortable one, both physically and temperamentally. I have never been good at watching people work a problem slowly when I can see the solution. The second option was to tell exercise monitor Oslin what I had found. This had the appeal of directness, but it would put him in a position he had not been placed in before. An outside observer had located the exercise solution before his cadets had completed phase 1. The protocol, as he had explained it, did not accept out-of-order submissions. There was no category for this. I was not sure what he would do, and I was not sure what I should do if he told me not to do anything. The third option was to fix it. I thought about this for roughly 4 minutes. The thing is this. In 28 years of building inspections, I encountered a situation on approximately 70 occasions where I found a compliance failure during a scheduled inspection and had to decide whether to write it up for remediation or address it on the spot. The standard procedure was to write it up. That is what the procedure exists for. But there were cases, perhaps 12 or 15 of those 70, where the failure was the kind that could cause harm before remediation was completed, and in those cases I always made the same choice. You fix the thing that can cause harm. You write it up afterward. The paperwork comes after the building is safe. This was not a real building. Nobody was in danger. The simulant compound was non-lethal. But I had also, in 35 years of looking at buildings and in the 8 months since retirement, found that my professional instincts did not recognize the difference between a real compliance failure and a simulated one. When the building tells you the problem, you fix the problem. That is what the reflex does. It is not a decision, exactly. It is more like the way you do not decide to catch something that is falling. You are already moving before the decision forms. I went back to the equipment station nearest the service panel, found the atmospheric sealant kit, extracted a tube of barrier compound and an applicator wand, and returned to the panel. Exercise monitor Oslin looked up from his datapad when I opened the panel. He looked at me. He looked at the sealant applicator. He looked at his datapad, which I assumed was showing him something he had not seen in an exercise before, an observer accessing a building service panel on sublevel 4, while Phase 1 atmospheric sampling was still in progress. I could not see his expression clearly from where I was standing, but I noted that he did not call out to me and did not move to stop me. I went into the access void. The joint ring was where I had left it. Working in a ceiling void is not comfortable work. It is cramped. The light is whatever your headlamp provides. The surface under your hands and knees is dusty metal, and the orientation required to position the applicator correctly on a pipe joint while lying on your side is the kind of thing that convinces you at 56 that your 30s were physically superior to your current condition. But it is not complicated work. Apply compound around the joint ring. Allow 30 seconds for initial set. Apply second layer with the applicator in the fill mode rather than the coat mode to push compound into the gap. Allow 90 seconds for working cure. I did not have a headlamp. I had the flashlight function of the communications device in my jacket pocket, which was sufficient. I did not have the correct applicator, exactly. The kit I had taken from the equipment station used a fitting I was not familiar with, but fitting geometries are universal enough that I found the correct mode after approximately 20 seconds of examination. I have been working with unfamiliar equipment in confined spaces since my early 30s. This is not a skill that requires extraordinary talent. It requires patience and the willingness to look at the equipment carefully before you try to use it. The joint ring sealing took 11 minutes. The drainage manifold relief valve was at the north end of the void, near the structural beam I had identified during my first pass. It was a manual valve of the type I had seen in dozens of buildings, a quarter-turn ball valve with a position indicator plate. The indicator plate showed 3 positions: open, closed, and a third position that was labeled in Vathan glyphic script I could not read. The valve was in that third position. The operating principle of a ball valve is universal. The correct position for a backflow prevention valve in a pressurized atmosphere system is closed. I turned it to closed and noted the position for the post-exercise report. I was out of the access void and back in the corridor 22 minutes after I had entered it. The cadets were finishing Phase 1. 2 of the 3 teams were annotating their atmospheric sampling data. The third team was in the middle of a technical disagreement about the calibration of one of their instruments, conducted in a mix of standard compact and what I took to be one of the Keshari species' own languages. The disagreement had the focused, slightly elevated energy of young professionals who care about getting the calibration right, which I found reassuring. I replaced the panel, returned the sealant kit and applicator to the equipment station, and sat back down on the bench. Exercise monitor Oslin was standing 4 meters away, watching me. I said in standard compact, "The joint ring at the material transition in the pressurization duct, approximately 20 meters north of the service panel, just past the second structural beam, had a hairline gap. 4 years old, I would estimate, based on the oxidation pattern at the joint ring. The barrier compound needs about 6 hours to full cure, but the working seal was in place within 90 seconds of application. The drainage manifold relief valve at the north end was in an intermediate position. I've moved it to closed. That should stop the secondary bleed path." Oslin looked at me for what I estimated was 8 seconds. Then he looked at his datapad. Then he looked at me again. "The protocol," he said carefully, "has 14 phases." "I'm aware," I said. "I'm not a cadet, I'm an observer." "Observers," he said, "do not have access to the exercise floor." "I'm aware of that too," I said. "There was an administrative error at intake. I believe my badge clearance was incorrectly assigned. I apologize for the confusion." He looked at the service panel. He looked at his datapad. He looked at the cadet teams who were beginning to transition to Phase 2 and had not appeared to notice anything unusual about the past 22 minutes, which said something about the focus of Keshari emergency management cadets that I found, again, genuinely reassuring. "You fixed it," he said, "not a question." "I found a compliance failure and I addressed it," I said. "It's what I spent 28 years doing. I wasn't making a judgment about the exercise. I was responding to the building." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The protocol does not have a procedure for early resolution." "I know," I said. "I'll write it up properly for your records. The full inspection notes the joint ring location, the oxidation pattern dating, the valve position, and the reasoning for the repositioning. You'll have everything you need for the documentation, but the building is sealed. The breach is contained." Oslin looked at his datapad for a long time. I have been in a version of this conversation approximately 40 times across my career. The conversation where the building has told you something that the procedure did not expect, and the person responsible for the procedure is deciding what to do with that information. It is never a comfortable conversation. The procedure exists for good reasons. The building does not care about the procedure. Usually what happens is that the responsible person writes a note, convenes a review, and the procedure gets adjusted. This takes time. What matters in the short term is that the building is safe. In this case, the building was a simulation, but the principle was the same. "Phase 2, Oslin said finally to his cadets, "continue." He made a note on his datapad. He did not say anything else to me for the next hour and 40 minutes, which was how long it took for the Phase 2 source localization teams to arrive at the joint ring in the pressurization duct and discover that it had already been sealed. That conversation was livelier. The team that found the sealed joint ring was a 4-person Vathan group, all young, all extremely capable, all deeply confused. Their team lead, a woman whose name I learned was Veth Oren, emerged from the access void holding the atmospheric sampling probe at an angle that communicated, without requiring words, that she had just encountered something the exercise simulation was not supposed to contain. She looked at the probe. She looked at the void access panel. She looked across the corridor at me, sitting on my bench. "The joint ring is sealed," she said. "It is," I said. "The source localization readings are showing a contained seal on the breach point." "Yes, the working compound was applied about 2 hours ago. Full cure takes 6 hours, but the working seal was sufficient to stop atmospheric migration." Veth Oren was quiet for a moment. She had the expression I recognize on engineers and technical specialists when they encounter a physical reality that does not match their model. Not distress, exactly, but a kind of recalibration effort that is visible in the very slight stillness of the face. She was updating her model. "Who applied the seal?" she said. I said nothing. I looked at Oslin. Oslin said in a careful tone, "Continue Phase 2. Log the finding. Complete the full source localization documentation." Veth Oren looked at him. She looked at me. She looked at the probe. Then she did what a good technician does when the physical reality and the model disagree. She documented both carefully and continued working. The next 6 hours were instructive. The 12 cadets completed phases 2 through 4 source localization, vector mapping of the dispersal pattern, and initial sector isolation, working around a breach point that had already been sealed. The exercise simulation, being a computational system, had not been informed that the physical breach had been addressed, and continued to generate atmospheric data consistent with an ongoing Class 4 event. The cadets' readings were showing the simulant compound dispersing through the ventilation runs in the pattern the simulation had been programmed to produce. They were working real equipment against a virtual problem that I had already resolved in the physical layer. This created a situation that exercise monitor Oslin handled with a steady professionalism I came to respect. He monitored his cadets. He graded their phase completions against the protocol. He did not stop the exercise. He made, I suspect, an extraordinary number of notes. I watched. In the 6th hour, one of the other cadet teams, a mixed species group that included 2 Sarathi and 2 individuals of a species I didn't recognize, all of them working with a careful thoroughness that suggested they were the top-rated team in the cohort, arrived at the drainage manifold relief valve during their vector mapping work, and found it in the closed position. Their team lead, a Sarathi named Dav Horath, stood in front of the valve for approximately 30 seconds. Then he turned it to the intermediate position it had been in before. Then he appeared to reconsider, turned it back to closed and made a note. Then he looked across the corridor at me. I nodded. He nodded back, with the expression of a person filing a very unusual observation in the correct mental folder, and returned to his team. In the 7th hour, a cadet from the mixed species team, one of the 2 I hadn't been able to identify by species, a compact, 4-armed individual with a deliberate way of moving that suggested strong spatial awareness training, passed my bench on his way to a water station and glanced at me with the particular sidelong look of someone who has been told not to ask a question and is not entirely succeeding at not asking it. I nodded at him. He stopped. "You were in the void earlier," he said. "Standard compact direct." "I was," I said. He looked at the service panel. He looked at the exercise floor, where his team was in the middle of a careful sector isolation sequence. He looked back at me. "How long did it take you to find the joint ring?" 35 minutes in the void. About 6 minutes reading the corridor beforehand. He was quiet for a moment, working something out. "The protocol allocates 8 hours to Phase 1. "Your team will be faster than that," I said. "You've been watching the instruments carefully. You'll get there." He nodded once, with the expression of someone filing information, and went back to his team. At the 8th hour, Oslin approached me. He sat down on the bench, not next to me, but at the far end of it, with the posture of someone conducting a professional conversation rather than a personal one, and he opened his datapad. "I need to document the sequence of events," he said. "Of course," I said. "You entered the exercise floor through the service lift at the initiation of the exercise." "Correct. Intake processing error. My clearance badge was incorrectly assigned. I believe the error originated from a transposition in the observer classification code. I can provide my intake documentation for review." "You identified the breach point without atmospheric sampling equipment." "Correct. Building inspection, reading the ceiling panel alignment and the ductwork routing." The material transition point was visible from the corridor access void. The gap in the joint ring was consistent with a 4-year thermal cycling pattern on a dissimilar material junction. I've written up the inspection notes." I handed him my communications device, which had the notes I had drafted over the past several hours. He read them. After a while he said, "You've described the oxidation pattern at the joint ring. How did you quantify that as 4 years without instrumentation?" Oxidation rate on that composite material at standard atmospheric pressure and humidity runs approximately 0.3 millimeters of surface penetration per year. The depth of the discoloration around the gap was approximately 1.2 millimeters. That's a rough estimate. You'd want a physical sample for accuracy, but 4 years is the right order of magnitude. He looked at the notes. "How did you know the relief valve was mispositioned?" "I didn't know it was mispositioned. I found it in an intermediate position, and I knew the intermediate position was problematic. Ball valves in backflow prevention applications have 2 correct positions, open or closed, depending on operating conditions. An intermediate position is never correct. It means the valve is partially obstructing in a way that isn't documented or intentional. In a pressurized atmosphere system under abnormal differential, a partially obstructed backflow valve will bleed in whichever direction the pressure differential pushes it. In this case, that would be into the drainage network." Oslin made a note. "The intermediate position is the valve's factory default. It arrived from the supplier in that position and was installed during the retrofitting of the pressurization loop. The installation record shows it as installed and functional." "That's consistent with what I found," I said. "Factory defaults aren't always operationally correct. A valve that arrived in the intermediate position and was installed in the intermediate position because nobody knew it was wrong, that's a very common finding. The documentation shows installed and functional because the valve was installed and it functions. What wasn't checked was whether the function was appropriate for the application." He was quiet for a moment. "Is this a common finding in human buildings as well?" "It's the most common single category of finding in retrofitted buildings with secondary system additions," I said. "After 28 years, I'd estimate it appears in roughly 40% of the buildings I inspected that had undergone significant secondary modifications. The formula is always the same. The new system works. The connection to the old system works. The default position of the connecting component is never verified against the operational requirements of the new application. Then you get the condition I found." He made another note. Then he said, "The protocol does not have a category for a breach identified and contained by a non-cadet observer before Phase 1 completion." "I know," I said. "I'm sorry for the disruption to your exercise." "The disruption," he said, "is to my grading rubric. The cadets are performing correctly, they're working the protocol as designed, and their phase completion quality is excellent. The issue is that the physical layer of the exercise has been corrected, and the simulation layer has not, which means they are grading against a simulation that no longer accurately models the physical state of the facility." "I understand," I said. "If it would help, I'm happy to describe exactly what I found and what I did, in full technical detail, in whatever format serves your documentation requirements. The cadets can verify the work independently. Everything I applied or repositioned is accessible from the service void." Oslin looked at his datapad for a long time. Then he said, "The Institute's Academic Oversight Board will need to review this." "Of course. The board convenes in 3 days." "I'll still be here," I said. He stood up. He looked at the cadet teams who were deep in Phase 5 sector isolation work with the steady, professional focus of people who are good at what they do and are doing it well. He looked at his datapad. He looked at me. "The exercise will run to completion," he said. "The cadets will receive full grading for their protocol work. The physical layer documentation you've provided will be filed separately as an observer incident report. The board will determine whether the protocol requires amendment." "That sounds correct to me," I said. Is there anything about the remaining building systems in this facility that you would like to document before the exercise concludes? I noted that he had asked this in a very neutral tone. I considered the question carefully before I answered it. I found 2 additional observations during my access to the void, I said. Neither of them is a safety-critical finding. The first is a fastener pattern in the ceiling void that suggests the northern corridor's structural reinforcement. I believe that was 4 years before my visit, was completed to a slightly different load specification than the original design, and the as-built documentation should reflect that if it doesn't already. It's not a compliance issue, it's a documentation gap. The second is a ventilation grill on the east face of the mechanical room door that's slightly out of alignment, probably a maintenance item. Something shifted during the pressurization loop installation and was never adjusted back. Again, not safety critical. Aslin made notes on both. I'll have those items cross-checked against the maintenance records, he said. The fastener pattern observation. That's the kind of finding that takes a professional how long to make. In a building I know, about 6 seconds, I said. In a building I'm seeing for the first time, it depends on the ceiling. This one, from the corridor access void, maybe 2 minutes. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, the protocol was written 41 years ago. The design parameters for the Class 4 exercise assume that source localization requires atmospheric instrumentation and full dispersal mapping before a breach point can be identified. That's a reasonable assumption, I said, for someone who doesn't know the building. Aslin made a final note. He walked back to his monitoring position. The cadets completed Phase 6 at the 12-hour mark. The review before the Institute's Academic Oversight Board took place on Day 6 of my residency. I appeared before a panel of 7, chaired by the Institute's Director of Emergency Management Education, a Keshari professor named Reth Orvan, who had the bearing of someone who has been running an institution long enough to have stopped being surprised by most things and was now mildly interested rather than surprised. He had read Aslin's incident report and my inspection notes, and the summary of my professional background that the Compact Observer program had on file. He said, you identified the breach point without atmospheric sampling equipment. Correct, I said. In approximately 35 minutes. 35 to 40. I was moving through the void carefully to avoid disturbing anything before I documented it. The protocol baseline for Phase 1 atmospheric sampling is 8 hours. I know. Reth Orvan leaned forward slightly. Walk me through the identification sequence, not the finding, the sequence. What did you read and in what order? I walked him through it. The ceiling panel alignment in the corridor. The shadow lines indicating the retrofitted ductwork routing. The logic of contractor routing choices, direct, efficient, threading through compromise points in the existing structure. The 3 locations where compromises were most probable based on the building's modification history as readable from the physical evidence alone. The access void, the joint ring, the thermal cycling pattern, the oxidation depth estimate, the valve. The panel listened. 2 of the 7 members were taking notes. 1, a Vathan member on the right end of the panel, had the expression of someone conducting a technical analysis in real time, and I directed some of my explanation toward her because her facial responses were telling me which parts needed more detail. When I finished, Reth Orvan said, is this method documented anywhere in Earth's emergency management literature? Not as a formalized method, I said. It's professional practice, the accumulated body of knowledge that experienced building inspectors develop over careers. You won't find a manual called How to Read a Building. You find it in the field over time. How long does it take to develop? I thought about this honestly. To the level of specificity I demonstrated, 10 years minimum, that assumes consistent field exposure in buildings with a range of modification histories. You need to see enough variations to build the pattern recognition. It accelerates if you're also doing compliance documentation work. Reading the paper record against the physical reality is what sharpens the identification of documentation gaps. 28 years, said the Vathan member on the right. 28, I agreed. That's the full career you described in the incident documentation. Yes. The Vathan member made a note and looked at her colleagues. A brief exchange in what I took to be Vathan passed between her and two other panel members. Then Reth Orvin said, "The protocol assumes atmospheric instrumentation as the primary source localization tool. Your method requires neither instrumentation nor access to building records. It requires the building itself as the information source." Correct. The protocol was designed to train emergency response personnel in the systematic use of instrumentation-based methods. That's a correct and sensible design goal, I said. Instrumentation-based methods are reproducible, documentable, and trainable. What I did is not systematically teachable in the way the protocol is designed to teach. It's a supplementary competency, not a replacement for what your cadets are learning. Reth Orvin looked at me with an expression that had moved from mild interest to something more considered. You are describing a competency that took 28 years to develop and that your cadets will not have at the point of deployment. Most of them won't at deployment. Some of them will develop it over long careers if they're working environments where the competency is applicable. But an officer with that competency, present in the field, could reduce a 72-hour containment timeline to 4 hours. In a specific set of circumstances, I said, the building has to be readable. That requires a modification history. A new construction without significant retrofitting is harder to read quickly. The Keshari facility happened to have a very clear modification record in its physical evidence, which made it relatively straightforward. 4 hours, said the Vathan member again. 3 hours, 40 minutes from corridor entry to completed valve repositioning, I said. I was moving carefully. A faster practitioner working in a building they'd previously inspected could probably do it in less. The board conferred for approximately 20 minutes, during which I sat in a chair near the room's exit and looked at the ceiling. The ceiling of the boardroom was original construction. No modifications. Clean, consistent panel alignment, fastener pattern on the standard module spacing, no shadow lines. The building was telling me nothing unusual, which was, for once, a comfortable finding. Reth Orvin reconvened the panel. He said, "The board will recommend 3 amendments to the protocol. The first, inclusion of building reading methodology as a supplementary localization competency in the advanced curriculum, to be developed in collaboration with the Compact Observer program. The second, a review of the Keshari facility's maintenance records for the items identified in your inspection notes, the as-built documentation for the northern corridor reinforcement and the ventilation grill alignment, and a cross-check of the pressurization duct joint ring against the supply-side materials documentation to confirm the dissimilar material junction was installed per specification. The third, a notation in the protocol's exercise design parameters that pre-existing building compliance failures in the exercise facility may interact with the exercise simulation in ways not anticipated by the original design, and that exercise monitors should conduct a pre-exercise building walkthrough at a senior level before each Class 4 initiation. I nodded. Those were all reasonable recommendations. The Compact Observer program will receive a formal incident report documenting your involvement, Reth Orvin continued, along with a recommendation that any future exchange program placements at this institute include a pre-arrival briefing on lift access procedures. That's also reasonable, I said. The cadets who participated in the exercise will receive full grading for their protocol work. Their performance was excellent and should be recognized as such. I was there for the exercise, I said. Their performance was excellent. They worked the problem correctly, systematically, and without any significant errors. The fact that the physical layer had been corrected before they arrived at it doesn't reflect on the quality of their work. Reth Orven looked at me for a moment. You watched them for 60 hours. I did. I had a bench and nothing else to do. Your assessment of their performance is a considered one. Yes. He made a note, then he said, one additional item. The exercise monitors report notes that you identified the breach point, completed the physical repair, repositioned the valve, and returned the equipment to the station in a period of approximately 45 minutes, inclusive of access and transit time through the sealing void. Working in an unfamiliar facility, with unfamiliar equipment, in a confined space. 45 minutes was the estimate. I wasn't timing precisely. Is that a typical working pace for you? I thought about it. Slower than my early career. My 30s were better in confined spaces, but the work itself, identifying the problem, selecting the right approach, executing it cleanly, that part doesn't change much with age if you've done it long enough. The physical part is slower. The reading part is the same. Reth Orven set down his datapad. He had the expression of someone who has reached the end of a professional assessment and arrived at a conclusion he finds interesting rather than troubling. The Institute's Academic Oversight Board thanks you for your cooperation with the incident documentation, he said, and for fixing the building. I said the building needed fixing. That was more or less the end of it. I completed my residency at the Keshari Institute over the remaining 3 weeks, in Gallery Level 3 as originally intended, which I reached without difficulty on every subsequent visit by using the correct lift. I conducted the 3 structured interview sessions with senior faculty and produced a documentation report for the Compact Observer Program on the intersection of Earth's building compliance frameworks and the Keshari Emergency Management Curriculum. The report included a section on building reading methodology and a recommended competency framework that could be adapted for the Institute's advanced curriculum, which Reth Orven's board had requested. It took me longer to write than the actual inspection had taken. Exercise Monitor Oslin and I had one final conversation on the last day of my residency. He found me in the gallery during a Phase 3 exercise, a different cohort of cadets working a different scenario, and he stood next to me for a while watching the exercise before he said anything. The joint ring, he said finally. The protocol assumes a Class 4 source is identified by atmospheric instrumentation. It has never occurred to anyone to ask whether a different kind of trained professional, looking at a different kind of evidence, could identify it faster. It's not a common situation, I said. You'd have to have someone with significant building inspection background in the exercise cohort, and those people don't generally train as emergency response officers. No, he said, they don't. He watched the cadets work for a while. The team on the floor was good, a tight 3-and-1 formation on the atmospheric sampling, with the 4th member on documentation, moving smoothly through their phase checklist. The protocol amendment, he said, the pre-exercise building walkthrough recommendation. Yes. Who would conduct that walkthrough going forward? In the short term, probably a building compliance officer on contract. In the long term, you could cross-train some of your experienced exercise monitors if you could arrange secondment with a municipal compliance authority. 6 months in the field would give a motivated person enough foundation to conduct the walkthrough with reasonable confidence. Oslin considered this 6 months. Minimum. A year would be better. And 28 years would be better still. Yes, I said, but most things are better with time. He was quiet for a moment. On the exercise floor below, The lead team completed Phase 1 and transitioned to Phase 2 with the smooth efficiency of good training. The documentation member moved to the equipment station on cue, pulled the correct kit, and began setup without looking at the checklist. The protocol baseline, Oslin said, is 72 hours because that is the established time for a trained team with correct equipment to work through all 14 phases correctly. I know, I said. 4 hours is not a training target. No, 4 hours is what happens when the building has already been read. Your cadets' 72 hours is the real work, the instrumented, documented, systematic work that produces graded results and defensible reports and trained professionals. What I did is not a replacement for that. But it is a supplement, he said. Everything is a supplement to everything else, I said. The question is what you have available and what the building is willing to tell you. Oslin nodded once. He watched the exercise floor for another minute. Then he said, "Safe travels back," and returned to his monitoring position. I watched the cadets finish Phase 2 and begin Phase 3. They were excellent. The lead team had found the source, the correct simulated breach point in this new scenario, using atmospheric instrumentation, systematic vector mapping, and a full 3-person consensus review before logging the finding. It took them just under 9 hours to get there. I sat in the gallery and watched, and said nothing about the ceiling. The building was telling me something. I kept it to myself. It was their exercise.